Hello everyone, my name is Sirwan Kejo. I'm with the Voice of America's Extremism Watch List, and today with us is Colonel Myles Caggins, who is the official military spokesman for the Global Coalition to Defeat IS. Colonel, it's good to have you with us on Voice of America. Let's talk about the latest in Syria and Iraq. I understand that the coalition has been involved with your local partners in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces. You have recently carried out certain raids against the Islamic State terrorist group. Could you give us some update on that, please?
Sirwan, first, good evening to Voice of America Extremism Desk and all of your viewers and listeners and readers around the world. Extremism is on nearly every continent, and what we are focused on here in Iraq and Syria is defeating Daesh. The global coalition, made of 77 nations and 5 international organizations, has been in the region since 2014, helping our partners in Iraq and partners in Syria liberate more than 8 million people, 110,000 square kilometers of land from Daesh's murderous rule. But our mission continues. Daesh is down, but not out. And I'd like to talk about some successes in recent weeks of the coalition and our Syrian Democratic Forces partners. ISIS announced a campaign during Ramadan, a campaign of terror. And what we've learned is that ISIS is failing. Because of the relentless pressure by the SDF and relentless pressure from the Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga, and commandos on both sides of the border, ISIS leaders find themselves under great pressure. In the past few weeks, the Syrian Democratic Forces anti-terrorism troops have killed or captured several ISIS leaders with the support of coalition special operations. The coalition troops share intelligence, provide air support, and at times accompany the SDF commandos on raids. During those raids, the ISIS leader of the Wali of North Baghdad blew himself up. A top-level ISIS logistics leader who was responsible for procuring and smuggling weapons, communications equipment, motorcycles, and other vehicles, killed. Other terrorist cells in the Deir ez-Zor province busted up. Many members of ISIS captured, or the ones who tried to fight, killed. This is because the SDF is responsible for defending the people of northeast Syria, as well as areas that the coalition moved out of last fall in October. And the coalition will continue to back up the SDF to keep the people along the middle Euphrates River Valley, Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor, Qamishli, and other places safe from the threat of Daesh.
Colonel, would you attribute these recent attacks, I mean, this surge in ISIS attacks both in Syria and Iraq?
ISIS announced that they were going to have an offensive during Ramadan. Now, that alone just shows you the type of people ISIS are. Attacks during Ramadan, a time when we should be reflecting on the blessings that God has given us. This terrorist group, ISIS, is going around and attacking security forces, burning crops, harming farmers, collecting illegal taxes, and other criminal activities and mayhem just to try to raise money and strike some fear into the population. A population they claim they want to control. Well, the population and the people in Iraq, the people in Syria, reject ISIS. That's why ISIS has to live in caves and mountains. They live in remote desert wadis. They're hiding out. They're not able to take any territory, control any populations, and the relentless pressure and pursuit from the SDF and the Iraqi security forces is keeping ISIS from being able to resurge. No doubt, ISIS is failing at their goals.
What are the challenges that the coalition and your local partners in both Syria and Iraq are facing at the moment?
Well, the coalition and our local partners have seen success, continued success in the defeat of Daesh. It was March in 2019 that the Battle of Baghouz ended, eliminating all of ISIS's physical territory. Since that time, in spite of ISIS propaganda, where they make claims that they are going to resurge, come back, take over large swaths of land between Iraq and Syria, they have been unable to be successful. Increased cooperation between the coalition and Iraqi security forces and SDF altogether is going to enable us to maintain the pressure and the coordination to stop ISIS sleeper cells from smuggling people, supplies, and money back and forth across the Syrian border through the Badia Desert and the Nineveh Plains and the Anbar Desert. But the global coalition is not just a military operation in Iraq and Syria. The 77 nations and 5 international organizations are cooperating on things to keep ISIS from being able to finance its terror activities. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies across the world are coordinating and sharing information to bust up terrorist finance networks. The global coalition is working with technology companies like Facebook and Telegram to reduce the ability of ISIS to spread propaganda and recruit. And international immigration and law enforcement agencies are stopping the flow of foreign terrorist fighters into Iraq and Syria. In fact, now when ISIS members are captured in Iraq, we find that most of them are citizens of Iraq who chose to join the group. 5 years ago, there were foreign terrorist fighters from more than 50 nations, many of them locked away in detention camps run by the Syrian Democratic Forces.
Now, one question that keeps getting asked is, what do you do with these foreign fighters that have been captured by the Syrian Democratic Forces since the since the military defeat of IS in Baghouz in 2019? How do you help, or do you have a plan to rid the Syrian Democratic Forces from these fighters? If you can talk a little bit about that, and whether the coalition has a conversation or has had any discussions with your local partners in Syria in terms of the fate of these fighters.
There are more than 10,000 ISIS members, ISIS fighters, being held in detention by the Syrian Democratic Forces at more than 24 facilities across east and northern Syria. Some of these facilities are really makeshift old schools or other old government buildings that have been converted into detention space. The SDF is doing a tremendous job and a tremendous service on behalf of the world by keeping the so-called caliphate in cages. Of these detainees, there are around 2,000 who are foreign terrorist fighters from more than 50 nations. And the global coalition believes that through appropriate international laws and protocols, there should be a final resolution for what happens with the foreign terrorist fighters. And in the meantime, we are continuing to support the SDF with stipends for the detention center guards, with equipment to make the detention centers safer for the Asaish who are providing securities, as well as safer and more humane for the detainees.
Kurdish officials have said in the past couple of months that they will start trying these IS foreign fighters locally. Now, this could be a challenge because the autonomous administration in North and East Syria is not an internationally recognized entity. How would you deal with that if Kurdish forces decided to move ahead with their plans?
Well, the global coalition does not have an official position on discussions about local tribunals in northeast Syria. We are primarily focused on established international law and a solution that is satisfactory for the nations of origin of each of the foreign terrorist fighters. And again, let me illuminate a little more. While this is an international problem that will require an international solution, it's also a long-term problem. So the coalition has provided more than $2 million in recent months for riot equipment, other security equipment, including cameras and structural security wire, improved doors, and personal protective equipment. So the detainees, guards, and detainees are not contracting COVID-19.
Speaking of COVID-19, what kind of support have you as a coalition provided to your local partners in both countries?
Yeah, in terms of COVID-19, the United States itself has provided more than $10 million in aid to the nation, to Northeast Syria, and many more millions to Iraq. In fact, the United States and the global coalition, but the United States in particular, is the largest donor to the crisis in Syria, over $10 billion since the civil war has broken out, and many more millions in aid to the people of Iraq. Not just the United States, though. There have been millions of dollars donated for COVID-specific aid from Belgium, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and other nations who are part of the global coalition and making contributions, because we recognize to defeat terrorism, you need to have a population that rejects terrorism. And you need to have stable cities, villages, stable society. And with the corona pandemic, this has caused the economy of Iraq to be challenged. The dollar has had less value in northeast Syria. So the coalition and coalition nations providing aid for medical supplies, personal protective equipment, coronavirus testing equipment is one of the ways that we are helping defeat Daesh ultimately.
So let's talk about Russia a little bit. After the partial withdrawal of U.S. forces from parts of northeast Syria in October 2019, some Russian troops have been deployed to the region. That has caused tensions at times between U.S. forces and Russian forces on the ground. On the other hand, this week we saw first the joint patrol between U.S. and Russian troops on the ground in this town of Rumelan in northeast Syria. Can you talk about a little bit about what's happening there on the ground between U.S. forces and Russian troops?
Sure, I want to make something very clear. There was not a joint patrol between U.S. and Russia. We do not coordinate our missions in northeast Syria. What people saw on video and some nice photos was deconfliction. The United States and Russia established a deconfliction protocol about 5 years ago for our missions both in the air and on the ground. And each day there are conversations between leaders here in the coalition and Russian leaders in Syria where we share and exchange information on where our patrols will go, the composition of them, and at times we have encounters. Those encounters are normally resolved in a professional manner, and what we've seen in recent days was the United States escorting a Russian patrol out of an area that was not deconflicted in eastern Syria. But again, these are all resolved peacefully. We do not seek to have any escalations. and our deconfliction process is mature, requires constant conversations, email exchanges, and we certainly call on the Russians to not do anything to have an escalation or interfere with the SDF mission to defeat Daesh.
Thank you for clarifying that point, Colonel. Now, my last question is about next week's ministerial meeting between, for the coalition, global coalition to defeat ISIS. What do you think will be discussed in that meeting next week?
On June 4th, the Global Coalition will have a ministerial level small group meeting. This meeting will be hosted by Italy but conducted virtually. After all, this is the time of coronavirus. But the more than 30 nations that will participate in this meeting are likely to talk about their continued commitment to the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but also globally. And it takes all of our nations to be successful against Daesh. It's not just as simple as bombing ISIS cave sites, capturing terrorists on the battlefield. This requires a commitment from many nations. And since 2014, 1/3 of the world's nations have joined the Global Coalition, including a few in the past year. So this meeting is likely to continue to talk about how the Global Coalition's nations will go forward into the next phase of our fight to achieve the enduring defeat of Daesh.
Colonel, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Erwan. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the next opportunity. And anybody who wants to keep up with the coalition's activities, please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. You can find us at CJTFOIR and also at Coalition.
Thank you.